Biometrics can feel like the future because it turns parts of a person's body or behavior into a way to unlock devices, enter buildings, or verify identity online. At the same time, biometrics can feel unsettling because you cannot change your face or fingerprints the way you can change a password, and that simple fact raises the stakes for privacy and security. For beginners, it helps to start with a calm reality check. Biometrics are not magic. They are a type of measurement, and every measurement comes with error, context, and risk. A face scan is not your face. It is a representation created by a system, and a fingerprint template is not a finger. It is a mathematical pattern derived from an image or sensor reading. Privacy risk arises when biometric systems capture more than needed, store data in ways that enable misuse, or use biometric information for purposes that people did not expect. The goal is to learn how to navigate biometrics safely by thinking clearly about how biometric data is captured, how it is stored, and how it is used over time, especially in environments where people may not have a meaningful choice. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first step is understanding what biometrics are and what they are not, because terminology can be confusing. Biometrics generally means measurements of physical characteristics or behavioral patterns that can be used to recognize or verify a person. Physical biometrics can include fingerprints, face geometry, iris patterns, and sometimes voice characteristics, while behavioral biometrics can include patterns like typing rhythm or how someone swipes on a screen. The key privacy point is that biometric systems often create biometric templates, which are derived representations intended to be matched later. A common misconception is that templates are automatically safe because they are not raw images, but templates can still be sensitive because they may be linkable, reusable, and difficult to replace if compromised. Another misconception is that biometrics are always unique and accurate, when in practice they involve probability and thresholds that trade off convenience against false matches. A safe approach begins by treating biometric data as high-sensitivity personal data, regardless of whether it is stored as an image, a recording, or a template. When you treat it as high sensitivity, you naturally demand stronger safeguards and clearer justifications. Capture is where many biometric privacy risks begin, because capture defines what is collected and under what conditions. A system that captures a fingerprint on a device in a user's hand is very different from a system that captures faces continuously through cameras in a public space. Capture questions include whether the capture is active, meaning a person intentionally presents a finger or face to a sensor, or passive, meaning data is collected without deliberate participation. Passive capture tends to increase privacy risk because it reduces awareness and consent, and it often expands collection to people who are not the intended users of the system. Capture also includes what else is collected during the biometric event, such as location, time, device identifiers, and context signals that can enrich tracking. Another critical capture issue is quality, because systems often store multiple samples to improve accuracy, which can increase the amount of biometric data held. Safe navigation means asking whether the system can capture only what is necessary, avoid capturing bystanders, and minimize additional metadata that is not essential to the purpose. It also matters whether the system is designed for verification or identification, because these are fundamentally different privacy profiles. Verification is when a person claims an identity and the system checks whether the biometric matches that claimed identity, like unlocking a phone that already knows who you are. Identification is when the system tries to determine who a person is from a set of possible people, like scanning faces in a crowd to find a match. Identification tends to be more intrusive because it can be used for tracking, surveillance, and broad inference, and it often affects people who did not choose to participate. Beginners sometimes assume these are the same thing because both involve matching, but privacy risk depends heavily on whether the system is confirming an intentional interaction or searching for identity in the background. Safe biometric deployment usually favors verification over identification, especially in consumer contexts, because verification aligns better with user intent and limits the scope of matching. When identification is considered, the justification needs to be stronger and the safeguards more extensive because the potential for misuse is higher. Understanding this distinction helps you assess capture choices with clearer eyes. Once data is captured, storage becomes the next big decision point, and storage choices can make the difference between a manageable risk and a long-term liability. A strong privacy approach prefers storing biometric templates locally on a user-controlled device, when possible, rather than in centralized databases. Centralized storage can be convenient for access systems, but it creates a high-value target, and it increases the harm of compromise because a breach could affect many people at once. Storage also includes whether raw images or recordings are retained, which is often unnecessary after a template is created, yet may happen for debugging, quality improvement, or vendor analytics. Beginners might assume raw samples are needed, but for many purposes they are not, and retaining them increases exposure. Another storage issue is whether templates are reusable across systems, because if the same template can be matched across different services, it becomes a tracking mechanism. Safe navigation means designing storage so that biometric data is isolated to its intended context and cannot easily be repurposed elsewhere. Retention and deletion are especially important for biometrics because the data is not easily replaceable. A safe approach uses the shortest retention that still supports the purpose, and it clearly defines what happens when someone leaves a program, closes an account, or no longer needs access. In workplace or school settings, retention often becomes sloppy, with old records lingering because systems are hard to clean up, and that creates risk that grows with time. Deletion must include not just the primary database, but also backups, logs, and vendor systems that may have copies of biometric data or related identifiers. Another subtle retention issue is whether the system keeps failed match attempts, which can create logs that effectively track when and where people tried to authenticate. Safe navigation includes asking whether those logs are necessary and whether they can be minimized or anonymized. Beginners should learn that retention is not only a storage question, but also a policy and operational question, because deletion must actually happen in the real system, not just on paper. Use is where biometric systems often drift into higher risk, because the same biometric capability can support multiple purposes. A system deployed to unlock a door can be tempting to reuse for time tracking, behavior monitoring, or security investigations unrelated to the original goal. A system deployed for account security can be tempting to reuse for personalization, marketing, or profiling, especially if it is linked to other data sources. Safe navigation requires purpose limitation, which means defining what the biometric is used for and prohibiting other uses unless a new assessment and clear user communication occur. It also requires transparency that matches the seriousness of biometrics, because people deserve to understand what is being captured, what is stored, and why. Another use-related risk is that biometrics can enable automated decisions, such as denying access, flagging fraud, or triggering security responses, and those decisions can affect people significantly. When decisions are automated, the system needs processes for review and correction because biometric errors are real, and an error can lock someone out of their account or falsely accuse them of misconduct. A privacy-aware approach treats biometrics as a powerful tool that demands careful boundaries around use. Accuracy and bias concerns intersect with privacy because they influence fairness and trust, and they change the harm profile when things go wrong. Biometric systems can perform differently across groups due to differences in training data, sensor quality, environmental conditions, and design choices. Face recognition, in particular, has a history of uneven performance across skin tones and genders in many deployed contexts, which can lead to higher false matches or higher false rejections for some people. Even when a system is not intended to discriminate, uneven error rates can create unequal burdens, like repeated verification steps or unwarranted suspicion. Safe navigation means acknowledging that a biometric match is a probability judgment and designing processes that handle uncertainty respectfully. It also means avoiding using biometrics as the only gate for high-impact decisions when errors could cause significant harm. Beginners often want a simple rule like biometrics are safe or biometrics are unsafe, but the reality is that the risk depends on accuracy, context, and safeguards. A responsible system assumes errors will happen and plans for them rather than pretending they will not. Consent and choice are more complicated with biometrics than with many other data types, especially in contexts where people cannot easily refuse. In a workplace, employees may feel pressured to accept biometric access systems because refusing could be seen as non-cooperation. In schools, students may have limited ability to opt out without consequences. In public spaces, bystanders may be captured without any real notice or choice at all. Safe navigation requires thinking about power dynamics and ensuring that alternatives exist when feasible, such as badge access instead of biometrics or passcodes in consumer authentication settings. It also requires clear communication that avoids burying the core facts in dense text, because people need to understand the nature of the system to make meaningful decisions. Another important point is that even when consent is obtained, it does not justify overcollection, excessive retention, or unrelated secondary use. Consent is not a license to do anything. It is one piece of a broader fairness and proportionality judgment. For beginners, it is important to understand that biometrics often demand stronger justification and stronger safeguards even when participation is framed as optional. Vendor and third-party risk is also central to biometric safety because many biometric systems are built or hosted by specialized providers. A provider may supply the capture device, the matching algorithm, the storage platform, or all of the above, and each layer creates potential privacy risk. Safe navigation requires ensuring the provider is restricted from using biometric data for their own purposes, such as training unrelated models or building cross-customer databases. It also requires strong security controls because biometric databases are high-value targets, and weak vendor controls can expose many people. Another vendor issue is transparency about how the system works, because some providers treat their algorithms as black boxes, which makes it harder to assess error rates and fairness impacts. Safe navigation means demanding evidence and measurable controls rather than accepting vague promises. It also means understanding the provider's incident response processes, because a biometric incident is not like a password leak. It can have long-term consequences for affected individuals. When providers are involved, your privacy posture becomes partly dependent on their behavior, so the relationship must be governed tightly. A good way to evaluate biometric systems is to think through a life cycle story from capture to storage to use, then to eventual deletion. Start with the capture moment and ask who is captured, whether capture is intentional, and whether bystanders are protected. Then examine what is stored, whether raw samples are retained, where templates live, and whether storage is centralized or local. Next, examine how matching is performed, whether it is verification or identification, and whether the system creates new logs or derived data that become tracking records. Then ask how the system is monitored, who can access data, and how access is logged and reviewed. Finally, ask what happens when a person leaves, withdraws, or no longer needs biometric access, including whether deletion actually propagates across systems. This lifecycle view prevents you from focusing only on one piece, like encryption, while missing bigger issues like function creep or retention. It also helps you propose safer design choices, like limiting scope, reducing identifiability, and ensuring alternatives exist. Safe navigation is less about fear of biometrics and more about disciplined boundaries around what the system is allowed to do. Navigating biometrics safely comes down to a few grounded principles that keep the technology in its proper place. You treat biometric data as highly sensitive because it is hard to replace and can enable tracking if misused. You design capture to be narrow, intentional, and respectful, avoiding passive collection and minimizing extra metadata. You prefer storage models that limit exposure, such as local device storage or context-specific templates, and you enforce short retention with real deletion. You limit use to the stated purpose and resist function creep, especially when biometrics could become a tool for surveillance or automated decision-making. You plan for error and fairness issues by building human review paths and avoiding high-impact decisions that rely solely on uncertain matches. You manage vendor relationships with measurable controls and strong restrictions on secondary use. If you keep those principles in view, Biometrics can support security and convenience without turning identity verification into an open-ended data collection system that people cannot realistically escape.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.